and welcome to episode 123 of Authors Afterword. On this podcast, I talk to an author about one, occasionally more, of their books in detail. And if you find yourself enjoying today's episode, do share it with your friends. So, I'm Charlie Place, and joining me today is an author of 13 books. It's a pretty awesome number, Carmel Harrington. We'll be talking today about her latest novel, The Stolen Child. This is a clever one. A person watches over a mother and child. They are all on a cruise ship. Later that night, Mum Kimberley takes young Robert and Lily to bed while husband Jason goes for a drink. Kimberley ends up taking a tablet for a migraine. In the morning, Jason's asleep beside her, but son Robert is gone. They've just docked in Barcelona, so the Spanish police are on the scene quickly and put the ship in lockdown, but only Robert's cuddly toy is found. The policeman suspects Jason, Jason's father slightly suspects Kimberley, who he's never liked, and no one finds Robert. Until 40 years later, and that's where we'll leave it for now. Hello, Carmel.
Hi, how are you? That's a great summary. I think I'll have to record that and use that for everybody.
You would be welcome to, that's fine, yeah. No, it's been a really interesting book, this one. And I'm going to have to start with the start, I suppose, the inspiration. Can you tell us about where this book's from?
Yeah, sure. Well, I get inspired by all sorts of places, from snippets that I found in historical archives that has inspired certain books. But this one came from a very personal moment in our family's lives. I have two kids, and they're teenagers now, but when they were small, we went on a family holiday to Florida, and my son sleptwalked for the first time. Now, what happened was we were in a hotel room, 2 double beds in one room. So the children are asleep in one bed and literally a foot away, myself and my husband. And woke up at 3 a.m. and I could hear a banging on the front door of the apartment. And my husband said, "Don't open it. We're in Florida. We're not in Wexford. I'll ring reception." And I looked through the peephole, could see nobody on the other side of the door. But I just had this instinct. I couldn't hear actually anything other than the thumping on the door. And that's because I suppose the doors are fireproof or whatever. But I opened the door anyhow, and sure enough, there was my little boy, and he was so distraught. I mean, I will never forget the horror of seeing him in the corridor of a hotel, so exposed and vulnerable at 3 a.m. and no idea how he got there. It was just a terrifying moment for the family. But we eventually worked it out that he had sleptwalked for the first time. And he came to when he got to the end of a very, very long corridor and came to the lift, and he heard the lift make a bing. And he kind of said he woke up and he was so confused. I mean, the poor little pet, he was only 5, and he was like, "Why am I standing out here?" Luckily for us, when we arrived at the hotel that evening, I had said to Nate and Amelia, because they were so excited, new hotel, first time in Disney, it was very exciting for them. And I had said to them, "Well, we won't forget which is our hotel room because it's at the end of this very, very long corridor." And he remembered that. And he said he got to the end of the corridor, and the only thing he couldn't remember was whether we were the left or the right of the corridor. And he guessed we were the left, and he was correct. We were terrified after that, and we had years of having to barricade ourselves anytime we were outside our family home. Well, even at our family home, we had to make sure every window and door was locked firmly and that he couldn't get through it. But it was later on in the holiday that my husband and I when I'd gotten over the shock and we were talking about it. And Roger, my husband, said to me, he said, like, if something had happened today, like if the horrifying what if had happened and someone had taken him or he'd had an accident, who would believe us, the parents, if we woke up the next morning and found that our child was gone from the bed right beside us? They'd say, there's no way you could sleep through a child going missing. They'd say, like, the finger of suspicion would fall on us. And then my husband, actually, it was so funny because he said, and no one would suspect you, Carmel, because he said, you kind of live your life with your heart on your sleeve and you're such an open book. He said, they'd all believe you. And I was like, oh my God, Raj, you are so screwed. You're in prison. Like you're so, totally going down with this. And it became a bit of a joke. And that was the moment that the idea started noodling in my head about what if a child went missing from that very close, intimate quarters. Everybody was in one room together. And what if you don't know what happened to the child and the reader finds out at the same time as the people involved do?
Okay. I've heard, and I think this fits in here, you do a lot of research. It's very important to you. Yeah. Can you tell us what sort of research you did for The Stolen Child?
Yeah, well, part of the story is set in the 60s and 70s in London. So, I mean, I visit London a lot anyhow. It's where my publisher is and my agent is. But I went on a research trip. The scenes in London in the 60s and 70s surround an orphanage in London and are set around Battersea and the social housing that was built there. post the Second World War. I did a lot of research in that kind of area, so I did that. I did a lot of research with orphanages and people who had spent time in orphanages in the 60s and the 70s to try and accurately portray what it would be like to be a child in that time in London, because obviously that's very different from my own experience. So I did research there. I think for the timeline, because the furthest it goes back to is the 60s and 70s, I'm very lucky because mum is from London, dad is from Ireland, where I live in Wexford. And my dad met my mum when he went to London. They're still there. So they were like an encyclopedia. They gave me so much content because there was a heat wave in the early 70s and my mum remembered that. And so she was telling me about that and about the killer ladybirds. And there's just moments in the book, they all happened. So that was where a lot of my research came from that. A lot of it was online and some on foot, actually walking in the shoes of my characters. It was interesting.
You said earlier about the readers finding out what happens at the same time as the characters, you're writing it. Mm. Can you talk about how you went about planning it, I suppose plotting? Yeah, the planning and the plotting. I'll leave my other question out till afterwards.
Yeah, it was tricky because there's 3 timelines and there are multiple secrets. So how to reveal, and there are deliberate roadmaps that send readers in one direction, and you kind of almost want the reader to think one thing and then to be surprised when they find out it's another. There was definitely one particular thing I wanted everyone to suspect and then to get the rugs kind of pulled out from under them, because I always knew I was going to use DNA as a tool to confuse readers. What I did was in the actual writing of it, in order to keep track of everything, because I knew I had to work very hard on the plotting, I had to make sure that while it was a complicated story, it didn't feel complicated to read it. So I wrote the 3 timelines independently. So I wrote almost like 3 novels, 3 novellas. So I had the Spanish part where the Murphy family, as you described at the beginning, the Murphy family are on a Mediterranean cruise. And you have mum Kimberley, her husband Jason, and their 2 children, 2 small children, 2.5-year-old Robert and 6-month-old Lily. And Jason is the stepfather to the elder of the 2 children, to Robert. And I wrote all of those scenes that happen within a few weeks in one continuous sweep. Then I went back to the 60s and I wrote all the parts, starting in an orphanage with a little girl called Sally and the girl she befriends in the orphanage, Elsie. And so I wrote all of those pieces right up until the 70s in kind of one go as well, right up until you find out what happens to Sally and Elsie. And then I wrote the now pieces with the Murphy family as they are now in Ireland, in Dublin, with Lily taking centre stage, who is Robert's little sister, now grown up with a family of her own. Now, I had to, of course, then rewrite the whole thing when I started weaving the story within each other. And you had to decide at what point you told things. So it was a complete rewrite, but it was very helpful for me to write them independently, first of all, to make sure that the story was complete for each section. You know what I mean? There were no holes in it.
Yeah.
And I remember when I sent it over to my editor in Headline, and Jen messaged me, she said that as she was reading it, she'd take a note and she'd say, oh, okay, what's this? And then she said, 2 chapters later, it was like, there's the answer. And she said, like, no matter what note I took, you had it covered. And I think the reason I had it covered was because I wrote them independently. So I was able to read it through in one full sweep, each part of the story, to make sure there were no plot holes. So if you had read each piece, you would have had a full and satisfying read of each piece independently. That's what I did.
That sounds really interesting then. So first, when you were saying about you'd written them separately, I was thinking, my goodness, how on earth did you get the pacing to be so good at the end of the book? And I suppose that's part of what you worked on with the rewrite.
Yeah, absolutely. I read a lot of dual timelines. And I don't know if you've ever done this. One always is more important to you than the other. And you find yourself skimming certain parts. I didn't want that. So I wanted to make it that every part was equally important. And that was the real trick for me. I worked so hard. So I had to make it that there were mysteries in the past and mysteries in the present, and that there was suspense in the past and the present. So always you want to go back to each era independently because you want to find answers. And the answers are both in the past and present. So it took time. There were several rewrites before I got it right. And then it was great when an editor came on board, because she said, oh, maybe you should switch chapter 3 to chapter 1. You know what I mean? There were a few little changes like that too that helped. But there was a lot of time spent on that for sure.
Yes, I definitely do get times where I prefer one narrative over another. Yeah. So yeah, I get what you mean there. Yeah, the things that I noted straight away with this book is that you introduce a possible Robert at the start,
Yes.
and then you're showing us Sally right away too, which obviously straight away you think, okay, that's the person who took Robert, which is very interesting. It's a very interesting thing to do. And I know that you've said about, always giving answers and things like that. But can you talk about this more, about giving those answers, or what we think are those answers up front, and working with the rest of it as well afterwards?
Yeah, and I did think a lot about that, because it would have been easy not really to do any of the bits in the 1960s and 70s until almost the end, and to leave that as a kind of a reveal at the end, when I feel that there are so many people wearing masks, and that we all wear masks every day, but some of us wear masks for so long to hide the pain of our past that those masks feel like the real version of you. And I wanted the masks to all be revealed. And when they fall off, then all the secrets spill out. So that was always in my head. I always knew there was going to be this kind of unveiling of people's true selves, and whether they would choose to leave their true selves revealed or whether they'd stick the mask back on. I thought that was always going to be interesting as I wrote it. And I did toy with just leaving the whole Sally Elsie storyline out until towards the end, but it just didn't feel right to me. I really wanted everybody to get an understanding of who these people are and their backgrounds, to help understand, because motivation played a huge part for me on this. Every single book I write very relatable, authentic characters. And what I mean by that is that while you might not do what some of these characters do in the book, what I want you to understand why they did them, and for it to feel like, okay, I can get that. I would never do that, but I understand why they did that. So that's really always been very important to me. Whatever book I've written, I have to make sure that those motivations feel relatable, or at least understandable. And the only way to make that right for me, for the reader to understand why Sally and Elsie act in the way they do, I had to go back to their roots. I had to go back to the beginning. Plus, I loved writing those parts. Oh my God, some of my favorite parts to write were those 60s, 70s scenes. And I found them very emotional to write. I think anything when you're writing about children who are upset or in peril or in any danger is quite an emotional thing to do. But I did toy with, as you said, I toyed quite a bit with how I might tell the story. I knew the story that had to be told, but how I shared it, it took a beat. I remember writing one scene in the 1960s, and it was the scene with Sister Jones, who is a nun in the orphanage. And I wrote a scene, and it was supposed to be like a flashback, but it became a whole chapter. And I went, oh, I really like this. I think I need to stay here for a bit. And that's why that part became, I think, as big as it did.
All right. Now, you said a little bit ago about the DNA and that being important. Can you tell us more about this, about why you wanted to explore this in the way that you did, I suppose?
Yeah, basically, I think DNA tells tales on so many people, and it's become so much more prevalent because, of course, DNA was a thing that since the 80s, really, it's used in investigations to a certain extent. And actually, when I did my research, talking about research, I looked into what was available in 83 when Robert goes missing DNA-wise. And they were only just beginning to use DNA, like hair samples and stuff like that, in the kind of the mid-1980s. So it wasn't really hugely used at that point in time. It was quite a new innovation in crime investigations. But now DNA solves cases all the time, right? But there are so many fascinating stories, as we read in the media, whereby I found out that's not my father, or I found out that I'm not actually their child, I'm adopted. And there's all these stories are exposed, and secrets come tumbling out of cupboards left, right, and centre because of DNA. And I thought this would be really cool to use that in this story. So that was why I decided to do that.
I need to ask you, I think, about creating the characters themselves. So if you could tell us about, I suppose, a little bit more on the characters that we touched on already, but also, I suppose, include Nicola in there because she's quite important. And Kevin also.
She is, yeah. What I love about characters, I love writing characters that explore kind of complex dynamics in relationships. And in particular, the sisterhood of women is always interesting to me, and the families that we choose ourselves as opposed to the ones that we are born into. So it was really interesting to explore Elsie, Sally, and then Nicola comes on board. So Elsie and Sally, as I say, they're actually not orphans as it happens. And it happened a lot in the 50s and 60s. If there was extreme poverty in a family, they would hand their kids over to social services to be kept in an orphanage, perhaps with the plan that you would pick them up later, but for all sorts of reasons, and certainly poverty being high there. maybe somebody is ill and there's nobody else to take care of the child. But there were so many stories of siblings who ended up in care because there just wasn't enough money at home. And it was a difficult time coming out the other side of World War II in England. And there was great poverty. And my mother was able to share a lot about that. It wasn't long since ration books had gone, so there was still in a recovery mode. And of course, London itself, with the bombings, there were a lot of houses destroyed. So that's why these high-rise buildings were built to have social housing for people. And the dynamics then changed because when I did my research, you had a lot of people who went from living almost in that kind of Coronation Street, EastEnders type terraced houses where everybody had an open backyard really and everybody supported each other and spoke to each other and had tea parties on the street, that kind of feeling. They were in it together. And then when they were sent to these high-rise flats in Battersea, like they didn't know their neighbours, they didn't see their neighbours, and they were structured in a way that there was no community there, and everything changed. And I thought that was really interesting to explore. So for Elsie and Sally, you have these two girls. They've been abandoned by their mothers in one way or the other, and they become as close as sisters in the orphanage. And within the orphanage, what I also decided to do for them, there were a number of ways I could go with that story. When I did my research, I came across as many horrifying stories as I did uplifting. And it's like everything at that time in Ireland, as well as in England, there was a lot of abuse happened. But that wasn't the only story there. And quite often the thing that we hear about more in the media is the abuse. They're the stories that go to court and we hear about. So I decided not to do that. I decided for Elsie and Sally that while they were in care, they would have a benevolent person who looked after them. And this was Sister Ailsa, Sister Jones, who's this Scottish nun. And she's just pretty cool. And she really took care of them. And she was loosely based on when I went to a convent actually myself here in Ireland. And one of the nuns that took care of us, she was really cool. She had a scooter. She used to come up to the school every day in a scooter and she wore the nun's veil. And you just see her coming up the road with the veil flying out behind her. And she was just cool. Do you know what I mean? She was just a cool woman. So that was those. And I really wanted the vulnerability of both of them. And definitely Elsie is older and wiser and more worldly than Sally, who's very young for her age in every shape of the form and just bewildered why her mother has given her up. And Elsie takes her on under her shoulders and they form this beautiful friendship and eventually sisterhood. And they both do something for each other. And what I wanted to share was that it wasn't just Elsie playing the role of the older sister. Elsie got a lot from Sally because Sally is just one of these beautiful characters. She's very giving with her love. And so Elsie got her first ever gift from anybody from Sally. And then when they get a little bit older, this was the other thing I found in my research, which is so shocking. Like at 18, only a few years older than my daughter. And it frightens me to think that at that young age, that as soon as you turn 18, you're gone, you're out of the care system then. And so these young boys and girls would find themselves then looking to find their way in life with no money and trying to find work. And there was a bit of stigma around the fact that they came from a home. So I wanted to explore that. And I wanted to explore what poverty does to people in those situations. And again, that was done through research. And Sally's always had this ambition to be a hairdresser. And she manages through perseverance all the time. She's such a worker. And she tries so hard to make her life better. And she finally gets like this apprenticeship hairdressing opportunity with Nicola, who runs this little backstreet hairdressing salon. And she becomes like a surrogate mother to Sally, again, the sisterhood. So they were kind of the characters in the 60s and 70s and through to the 80s. If we move to Ireland, then we have the Murphy family. And as the story progresses, we meet the Murphy family when they're married with the two children. And so you have Jason and Kimberley, and they just have a beautiful love story. They absolutely love each other. And Jason is stepdad to Robert. Then they have this little girl together. And then tragedy happens. And it's what happened to them post that tragedy, which was kind of interesting. You don't find that out until the story moves to the present day. And then you find out what happens to the two of them. You mentioned Kevin, and Kevin is actually Jason's dad. And he was very useful for me because I wanted him to show some doubt. All the doubt, fingers of suspicion are definitely pointed at Jason, the dad in the Murphy family. But I felt it was important that we kind of had some fingers of suspicion elsewhere. And Kevin definitely does that. He's Kimberley's father-in-law and he is deeply suspicious of her as well. So they're kind of the main characters. And then in the present day, your characters then are Lily, who is Robba's little sister, all grown up. And she's married to Michael and they have a little son, Ben, and she's a psychotherapist. And again, it was really important to me that she's grown up. Her character was so interesting to write because I was thinking, like, if you grew up and your older brother had gone missing and you'd spent your whole life in the shadow of that enormous tragedy to your family, what does that do? And I explore that throughout the novel quite a few times as to what that did to her in particular and her relationship with her parents. And she's almost become their carer now. Like, she's in the middle of a battleground between her mum and dad. So I had to give her a beautiful life. So her husband and her son, they're very happy together. And then Zach's character is really interesting too. And this is just going to upset everything because his theory means that there's all sorts of motivations, like what, how did this all happen? And that's what the reader has to find out. They're quite an eclectic bunch, really.
Yeah, you said about Kevin, and that's something that I don't know if I've got an actual question on it. Maybe you can extrapolate from what I say, but no matter how many times Kimberley notes that Kevin doesn't like her, and I think you do it a few times, I looked back and went, no, you did give us the information. I thought it was the single mother thing. I never once suspected anything. You did a really good job of that, yes.
Thank you. And I do think it was that, really. It was a single mother thing for him in many ways, but also maybe an instinct. We all have instincts, don't we? Sometimes you just can't put your finger on it. You've got that feeling in the pit of your stomach where you go, something just feels wrong, your spidey senses, my son would call it. It's nice to have the elder, somebody from the outside who's not playing a huge role, but is there and just every now and then can just say something that will make you go, ooh, yeah.
Well, you've got someone who's grumpy and potentially very negative, but then later on and throughout with Lily, we see that she's a really nice person, which was, it's quite, for a lesser important character overall, you've got a lot of development there.
In the 1980s in Ireland, single mothers would have been really frowned upon. You know, we were very much under the chokehold of Catholic Ireland at that stage. Divorce wasn't in Ireland. Single mothers, I mean, the mother and baby homes were still in play at that stage. I mean, if you were pregnant in the 1980s and you were a single mother, it was frowned upon, very much so. The stories that I know in my timeline, because I grew up in the 1980s in Ireland, parish priests would turn away a single mother from church because she wasn't married. That's what it was treated like. While there's always exceptions to the rule, 90% of Ireland would have been judgmental of Kimberley with her 6-month-old son on her own. So he had to kind of be that voice in Ireland for that reason.
Yeah, when you started the storyline of the orphanage, I did think, I sat there and thought, oh, okay, we're going to go down the kind of very heavy route with the information. And there was part of me that was just so like, oh, phew, you know, you've done something where there's positivity here. There is Sister Jones, who's lovely. Okay, they've got this, the house mother, who isn't great, but she's nicely balanced out. Yeah, that was good. So the locations, I'm going to go to a completely different topic now. You've got the 4 locations, as you've said. Why these places? And also, like, why these 4 different locations, if that makes sense?
When the little boy goes missing, I knew I wanted them all to be in one room together. I wanted it to be a very intimate, close quarters. And I just was trying to think, what was I going to do? And our family liked cruises. So then I started doing my research on 1980s cruises, you know, and they were something that families would have gone on, like if you had the income. And they did have the income because Jason has his own, he's a bit of an entrepreneur, he owns flats, and so he's done well for himself. So I thought, well, that solves that. They're going to be in a closed quarters when the little boy goes missing. So that's good. On the location, I really wanted it to be Spain. I wanted it to be close enough to England and Ireland. And again, I looked at where do people mostly go on holidays and where was the most popular? And Spain was it. It was more, it wasn't really Greece. It was more Spain for English and Irish holidaymakers. So I thought, okay, I really wanted it to be Cadiz, actually, because we had done a cruise and the port of Cadiz, but that wasn't an option because it didn't happen in 1983. I wanted it to be accurate. So I thought, nope, it wouldn't be Cadiz, it'll be Barcelona. So that was that. Ronda in Spain plays a huge part in the story. And the reason it's Ronda is because I love it. And I went there when I was in my 20s. And that moment, there is a moment where Lily and Zach in the now are in Ronda. There's a very beautiful old bridge that connects the old part of Ronda and the new part of Ronda. And it literally, you're in the clouds. You're so high up in the mountains, you're in the clouds. And I remember standing there in my 20s and feeling like I was in heaven. And we were so high up, the birds were flying under the bridge. And I was completely awestruck by this, that I could almost feel the wind of their wings flapping. I never forgot it. So the reason it's Ronda is because it's a place that I loved when I visited there and I just thought so rural. London, I know very well. I'm very comfortable there. So I was able to choose that as a location. Dublin, easy, lived there for years. So the locations kind of came to me then after that.
There's just this thought in my head that I think you've used maybe more locations than other books may have of thriller, but you've done it really well. It's not, I'm not saying it's a drawback or anything, so it was really, really interesting to see that and to see how much you had included and how well it all fitted together.
Thank you.
So yeah, no, it was fascinating.
I've such wanderlust my whole life. Honestly, I grew up in Wexford quite rurally, but I always remember looking out. We lived close to the beach and looking out over the horizon and thinking, I want to see what's on the other side of that horizon. So my first job when I left school was with Aer Lingus, our national airline, and I travelled the world with them. Places I've been to or places I want to go to are always going to be in my books, I think.
I want to ask you about incorporating the prostitution storylines, I suppose we should say, because there are two in there. And I know that with Sally's mum, you do give us enough for us to work out what's likely happened in terms of Sally being given up and what her mum's doing. Yeah, can you talk about your decision to include prostitution in the novel?
Again, in my research, when I looked in the 70s, and if you had no money and things were really bad, there wasn't many options. It was a decision that some people had to make. And when I researched and I did my interviews, I came across that quite a few times. Then I started looking at, well, what was happening at that time in the 70s? And of course, then I came across the Ripper. There was a lot of stuff in the media, like continuously talking about women. The newspaper articles I read, and every headline was all about that these women were somehow less than because they were murdered, but they were murdered because they were prostitutes. And so therefore, they're not really that important. And really, everybody kind of came to and became horrified when a young student was murdered by the Ripper. It was like, okay, well, if he could do it to a student, an innocent student, that mattered. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then I thought, okay, well, nobody makes a decision. We don't wake up and kind of go, okay, one day I'm going to be. And I kind of thought, what drives you to that? And I knew that I was going to do this poverty storyline. Sally, her mother gave her up and she was on her own. And she, at the age of 4, that young age, she had to learn to do things for herself. But she was such a nice person. She met people along the way who helped her, like Elsie and Nicola and Sister Ailsa, Sister Jones. But ultimately, she used to do a lot herself. And so for her arc, I really wanted to explore, well, what if things got so bad? Like, if you're starving, what do you do? And I wanted to show the desperation and the decisions that we make are sometimes out of our control. We have no choice. Choices are not given to us. I can remember when I worked in Aer Lingus, and I remember having no money, like literally by the time I paid my rent or whatever. But I was never going to starve because I had a family in Wexford that I could go home to. There were always people I could turn to. I was never, while I might not have had a huge amount of cash, I was never going to be rooting through bins. But not everybody has family. And the point was, for Sally, she didn't have anybody to turn to. So she was on her own. So that's why the whole idea of exploring the prostitution storyline for Elsie and Sally's mother, that's where that came from. It was hard to write, though. Hard to research it, hard to read those headlines and delve a little bit deeper into it,
Yeah, I can imagine. You've also brought up something that's made me think. You have that end of a chapter, I believe it is, yes. I can see it in my mind on the page, where Sally leaves the orphanage and you say that she knows that she's not going to come back. And I loved how you, although she doesn't go back, she does talk to Sister Jones.
I had that because Sally basically is at the end of her tether, really, and she's no money. She's in they're real places now where Sally and Elsie live. And if you look on YouTube, there's first-hand interviews. They all were basically saying that you don't see your neighbours, you don't talk to your neighbours. It was that lack of community that really coloured the experiences for people. And they were so lonely because they were saying, like, one minute they were in this lovely road where they knew everybody. And if you needed a bottle of milk, you just went next door. If you needed a cup of sugar, that all disappeared. People were brought in from all over London. So your neighbours were gone. That community was gone. And so for Sally, I really wanted to show her she's here in this block of flats surrounded by 1,000 people, but never lonelier than she's ever been in her whole life. And then all of a sudden she starts thinking about the orphanage and saying, like, when I was in the orphanage, while it was difficult and while it was regimental and while there was some cruelty there, like it wasn't to walk in the park, she always had food. She mightn't have liked the food, but she always had food. She always had a warm bed. And I thought that was kind of interesting to explore, and that sometimes, there are depths, isn't there, and levels to how bad things can get for people. And there's perspective. You might think you're having it bad and then it gets worse. And you're like, oh, that was easy, And it was kind of that for her. So I had this moment. I do think that in life, we all have pivotal moments in our life where somebody says something, and it could be somebody famous. You might just look at an interview with someone and they say something and it stays with you for life. And like I remember seeing an interview when I was in my 20s with Oprah Winfrey, and she asked the question, are you living your best life? And it's a question I ask myself regularly now. And I will kind of just take a moment to take a check and say, am I living my best life? And then I might kind of go, actually, I need to do more walks. I'm in my office. I'm not. Whatever it might be for me at that time, I check myself with that question. It stayed with me. It was like a moment in an interview with Oprah, but I've never forgotten it. But I think most people have somebody who said something to them at some point in their life. It might be a grandparent, it might be Oprah, it might be a lyric in a song, but somebody has something. And for Sally, it's Sister Ailsa, Sister Jones. And before she leaves the orphanage, she tells her, she said, remember, you can do this. Great things are waiting for you. You've got to fight for them. And so she reminds herself, she's at the end of her tether. She's, I'm going to ring. And she rings and she gets in touch. And then Sister Jones reminds her, yeah, you've got this. And that gives her the added motivation to go chase those dreams and keep pushing to be a hairdresser, you know. So it was a nice moment for me when I wrote that, actually. It was a full circle moment for Sally.
Oh, that's lovely. I'm going to bring the tone down, I'm afraid, which I feel bad for doing. But
oh, go for it.
Everything you're saying here, and you're saying about looking into things as you are, I really feel that I want to bring Ian into this and say, where does he fit in this in terms of you looking at things, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Well, again, that was all down to motivation for character, because I knew I was going to do the orphanage in the 1960s. I knew that. I knew I was going to have two girls who become best friends. And I knew that the water was going to be muddied with them two as to who took Robert from the Murphy family, right? So I always knew that. And I was kind of going, okay, so working on the background for both girls then came as the story evolved. We find out at the very end of the book, Elsie's background, because she never shares really her early childhood. Because when Sally meets her, she's 8 and she's been in the orphanage for a few years. And you only find out Elsie's background at the very end. But for Sally, you kind of get it from when she's 4. You see early on, you see what her life was like with her mother before she was handed over. What I wanted to do was, I liked the idea of Sally almost having this romantic notion, like she is not as worldly as Elsie. Elsie has snuck out to meet boys when she was in the orphanage, and she always was very much aware of her own sexuality and of her own power over men, if you like. And Sally was just kind of like the flat-chested, mousy friend or whatever, and she blossoms, of course. She was kind of always ignored and overlooked by Elsie, who would have got more attention. So I think then it's kind of the first person who shows you that love. It's a big deal for you. If you've kind of been in the shadows, then all of a sudden then somebody notices you and they are love bombing you. It's very easy to get carried away. And I felt that it would be really interesting that she would marry very quickly and not really have asked enough questions. She really thought she was being almost saved by this man. And she had this thing in her head. She wants the safety of having a house and a home and everything. And he seems like a protector. He's a police sergeant. So he's in a position of authority. And so you kind of get this moment where she just literally can't help herself. She falls madly in love with him, and he's handsome. Everything about him, he is the dashing hero that's there to kind of save her. And then when she has those little red flags, which she does get, there are red flags, and we see those, she pushes them away. You always felt like you could change every man you ever met. And I would say to my daughter now, I always say to her, when someone shows you who they are, believe them. Just do nothing else but promise me you'll do that. And I say that often because I can remember when I was dating, I wouldn't believe people when they showed me who they were until I got the sense and I got the maturity. You kind of understand what you want and don't want, and understand what you're willing to accept. And then you're ready to kind of say, no, thank you, very quickly and very early on. But it takes a bit of time for that to happen. And Sally hasn't had that. Like, the first man she dates is Ian. And everything he's saying to her is what she's been dreaming of since she was this 4-year-old little girl who has been abandoned. And she just wants someone to love her and take care of her. She thinks she's found it, which clearly she hasn't with Ian, you know. And he was just an interesting character to write because I had to get the balance right where you see signs of his cruelty, but they couldn't be so evident that you would go, well, why the hell did she fall for him? Like, it had to be subtle, and then you really see who he is. I really wanted that to be a shock for the readers as well as her, that it's like, okay, we've gone now from not sure if we trust him to now this man is evil, like he's horrible. And then it was down to, I had to think about how much of him do I want on the page? And should he be alive in the present day or shouldn't he be alive? And where is he? And why has it? And I had to be very careful what I did with him, because by handling him in the wrong way, it would have put too many plot holes. So I had to be really careful with him, actually. He caused me a lot of late night thoughts as to how I deal with him so that it fitted into the story. He was a tricky one.
Yeah, I remember reading, again, I think it's the end of a chapter, and Ian is saying something a bit flirtatious, and that's when Sally, I think, turns around and notices he looks quite nice, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's quite sudden. And then you get to the chapter where, yeah, she's getting married to him, and I had to flip back because I was like, hang on, this is only like 3 months. Hang on, what's happened? You know, is my copy wrong or something? That in itself, I think, just the lack of time, without you saying anything else even, although the characters do say it,
Yeah.
was a sign of what's to come in itself. Yeah.
It was. And again, there was a lot of thought about that, because there were chapters between her meeting him and them getting married that we actually cut in edits, because the first draft of the book was 140,000 words. We were getting close to it being a tome rather than a novel. And we had to decide which ones were more important to keep. The way we decided about it was that it had to be, she was marrying him in haste. And he deliberately was doing that. He was actively putting a ring on it very, very quickly, because he wanted to get her and he wanted to pull her away from Nicola and from Elsie and from Sister Jones, and take her and kind of isolate her in this new home that he bought. But it had to happen very, very quickly. So there were a number of reasons why that happened. One was, I felt it added to the immediacy of the story, if you like, and it made the pace better. Because when there's 3 timelines, it would have dragged if like I'd written a scene where the 4 of them went on a date. But then what we ended up doing was we just included later on, and she kind of reflects on how that didn't go well. So we reduced a lot of those chapters into a couple of sentences. While they might have been enjoyable to read, I think ultimately they would have dragged the story. And I think readers would be now saying, you know, oh, I kind of lacked a bit of pace in the middle. That kind of got us to where we needed to go quite quickly.
Yeah, no, by that time the pace has definitely gone quicker. So yeah, I can see what you mean there. That's interesting. So the sentences about the dates sound quite informed, and that would be why, because you did write them. Okay.
Yeah, really thought about them. And it was kind of like how to make them that we kind of packed a punch within a couple of sentences. So the story carried on. Like there was a lot of thought, like stuff like that. It's funny, like, isn't it? But like, they're the stuff that you can spend days worrying and thinking about. And that decision really impacts the story. And you hope then that readers will go, yeah, that's great. So yeah, it's really lovely hearing your feedback, actually. Thank you.
No, I really I enjoyed the experience of reading this book as much as I enjoyed the plot itself as well. I think this is probably where I go back to a question that I originally had at the start, and then I realised, no, it didn't fit there. Your son, I believe, gave you some of the idea for this book. I believe you say something like that in your acknowledgements. And then something lovely that I've never seen before, he has his own little note afterwards, at the very end of the book. Can you talk about Nate's idea, how you incorporated it, and I suppose also including a little note from him?
Yeah, sure. So this is where anyone who hasn't read, this is going to be the big spoiler, right? So we're going to just go straight out with it now. But it was a couple of years ago. He was about 9. He's 13 now, just turned 13. So he would have been about 9. And always, I'm really lucky. Like, my kids are super supportive. And when they come home from school, we have dinner together, and I will say, how's school today? Have you got much up with the usual? But they will also ask me, how was your day? Do you get much writing done? And they always are really interested on my word count, you know. And if it's more than 1,500 words, then they kind of cheer. If it's less than 1,500, they go, oh, you know, like they kind of know that's my goal every day. As it happens, Amelia wasn't here. It was just Nate. And I said to him, you know, I spent all day today trying to work out the plot for this book that I want to write. And I was telling him, I said, it was inspired by that night that you walked. And I want to write about a missing child. And so he loved that idea. He was going, wow. So I could have really inspired a whole novel. And I said, well, yeah, but it's not going to be about sleepwalking. But yes, the fact that a family would go through the horror of that. But I said, I don't know if I can write it. And he was like, why? And I said, well, the reason I don't know if I can write it is because I know what happens to Robert. I know where he is, and I know who took him, but I'm not sure I know why. And I said, it has to feel an understandable, authentic reason for them to take him. And I can't work it out. And he was thinking about it, and he was going, And he said, what if he's just taken her back? What if she's just taken him back? What if she's really his mother? And it was like, I nearly fell off the floor. It was so incredible and so insightful. I was going, oh my God, I think you have just made this novel for me. Because the other twists and turns were there. I knew about the DNA. I knew that was there. So I knew that was going to be a really big reveal for readers, that you're going to be so convinced that Zach is Robert, and then the DNA comes up and the DNA is negative and you're like, oh my God, And then I wanted it to be as well kind of, well, these two girls in the orphanage, Sally and Elsie, they have to be, one of those has to have taken him, and why? And so you're kind of going, okay, so it's definitely one of them. Fine. I don't mind the readers thinking that. I want the readers to think that. But I had to come up with this reason. And I thought, Nate, I said, you've just done it. Like, it's incredible. And I don't think he even realized how incredible the idea he gave me. Like, he couldn't really remember it. So I remember ringing one of my best friends, is a thriller writer, Catherine Ryan Howard. And I just said, are you free for coffee? And I went to Dublin. We met for coffee. And I just said, I've been noodling this idea and I want to tell you the whole plot. Just listen. And I told her the whole thing, including that big twist. And she was like, I have goosebumps. And she said, if you don't write this story, I'm going to do it. When I kind of got her stamp of approval, I thought, right, that's it. I'm going to have to write this now. And then I started pitching it to my agent and she was like, oh my God, Carmel, this is great. So it took off from there. So yeah, it was Nate. And he was so thrilled. And he's gone, do I get half of the money? Do I get like half the royalties? And I was like, no, Nate, I had to write 140,000 words. But I said, what you do get is you get a new bedroom. So we did. So he calls it his penthouse. He has a very cool teenage bedroom upstairs. And that was his gift from me. And the book is dedicated to him. So it's really nice. And then you mentioned about the note. It was literally, I was writing my author note, which I always do at the end of every book. I like to do, my acknowledgements are one thing, but I do like to do an author note to kind of give the readers a little bit more insight into my thoughts behind the book. And you don't have to read it, you can skip it, but some people kind of like that detail. So anyhow, I was writing that, and again, he came home from school and he said, how was your day? And I said to him, I wrote an author note. And he said, oh, that sounds really cool. And then I just said to him, would you like to write one? And he was going, I really would. So I said it to my editor in Headline, and I just said, I don't want it to be edited. Like, you can obviously make sure there's words dotted and I's dotted, whatever, but it has to be his, I don't want you to copy edit it, is the word, I suppose. So he wrote his piece, he hand wrote it, and I typed it up and we sent it over. So his note is in the back and it's his voice. He will have launched the book and the book is dedicated to him. So
that's wonderful. I'm not going to be surprised if in some years we get, I think your daughter's called Amelia?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, if we see an Amelia Harrington on the front cover of a book, or a Nate Harrington maybe on the front cover of a book, you're giving them so much information on how to be an author, I think. Yeah. Oh.
Well, Nate always said, actually, Amelia is, she's very creative and she's the artist. She's like a very, very talented artist and a very creative young lady. But Nate is definitely my son in every way. Like, he spends his life with his head in the clouds. And I always say to him, that's okay, because I've now made a living out of that. Like, when I was in school, teachers would always say, every report card, Carmel is so quiet, because I was very well behaved. I was. But the reason I was quiet was because I was in my imagination. So I wasn't listening in school. I was making stories up in my head. I would come across as being this quiet kid, but I was everywhere. I was with Tolkien. I was with, Samwise and Frodo. I spent a lot of time in school in Middle Earth, to be honest with you. I really did. I was obsessed with that book, and I think I was there more than anywhere else. And then I can remember getting my hands on some of Mum's more adult books, like a bit of Jackie Collins and Barbara Taylor Bradford and all those, and loving those when I was, a teen. My imagination was just always with books, and he's like that. So if a teacher says to me, he's quiet in class, I thought, yeah, I bet he is. I wonder what world he's in right now. He's got a great little imagination. So it wouldn't surprise me if he wrote books at all. Nothing would surprise me less.
Hey, you had me on tenterhooks with that story of how he gave you the information. That was a really interesting thing to hear about, definitely. So Elsie/Kimberley.
Yes.
She obviously does have things that people are saying that what you did wasn't right, etc. But there's obviously, you've got a choice throughout or it becomes apparent throughout, to kind of dob her into the police. Yep. And you don't do that. She doesn't have as big a comeuppance as you might have thought was an option, or that kind of thing. What were your decisions here? I suppose it had more to do with like the friendship and things like that.
Well, first and foremost, if you go back to the cruise ship, when Sally finds Elsie, who is now Kimberley, and when she finds her reaction is to call the police, is to call the authorities, is literally to make sure that she hates her for what she's done to her. She can barely speak. She's so furious with her. But immediately, like Elsie is very, very clever. She's very quick-witted. And she immediately says, if you tell the authorities who I am and that I took Robert, if you do that, Ian is going to find out. And at this stage, Sally has left Ian, and Ian is just this horrible, horrible person. And she knows he's told her he was going to do everything in his power to take her son from her. So she knows if she goes to the authorities, she will lose Robert anyhow, because Ian has the money and the backing of the police force, and she will lose her son all over again. And that's why she makes the decision to run and hide. In the present day, when all of the answers come spilling out and all the secrets come spilling out, and you have this big showdown, and they're reeling from that. And I wanted the reader to be with the characters as they're all in the room, kind of going, what the hell is going on? This can't be right. And I deliberately had wrote that scene, that really, really, really beautiful, poignant scene where the family are reunited, just the four of them. And you've got Kimberley, Jason, Lily, and Zach. And the four of them are in the apartment that Kimberley and Zach initially were in. And they're there together, and they are literally having this moment whereby all of the gifts every year, Jason and Kimberley bought a gift for their son who was missing, and they have all been in the attic, and they take the gifts down from the attic, and he opens up 40 years of gifts. And so there's no doubt in anyone's mind, he is Robert. And then the DNA says he isn't. And it's like, what's going on? And then there's a knock on the door, and it's Sally. And we haven't seen Sally since the 1980s, and Sally is back. And it really had to be, I felt it had to be down to Zach at this point. Everything's been laid out, and we now know Elsie's secrets. We now know what happened to her as a child. So I had to show her motivation and show, while I would never do that, I kind of understand her. So we had to show that. So we did that with what happened to her. So you have that moment of understanding with everyone. And then the anger kind of goes then. And then it's down to Zach. And Zach is kind of going, yeah, I'm done. But she does get her comeuppance. The comeuppance is, I always knew the last scene was going to be Elsie's / Kimberley's. The mask has to go back on, and she's on her own. So now she has no choice but to create this moment. If it was a game, she lost and Sally won, because everyone in her family and everyone she loves are now in America with Sally. This new kind of blended, slightly crazy, bonkers family that aren't related but that yet are related. And they've all bonded together, and they're living their best lives. Are you living your best life? Yes, we are now. On her own, in the apartment, still with her empire, is Elsie / Kimberley. And she is down to saying to this couple who were viewing a property, and she's basically saying, oh, I'm very close to my family and I see them all the time. And she has to make up this story. She's on her own, so she's lost. So her comeuppance is that despite all of her best efforts to keep her secrets and to keep her family together and to not lose, she lost everything anyhow. Jason, he becomes so obsessed with finding out the truth. I think he's actually one of the biggest tragedies of the whole story is the consequences for him. Like, he basically loses 40 years of his life, and the toll on him is incredible, you know. For him, I was angry on his part. I kind of, in a way, it would have been satisfying. One way would have been of having her in prison, like, but it just didn't feel right to the story. I felt like they'd been through so much, and she didn't win in the end. She was on her own. And I don't think Kimberley for 40 years, like, she threw herself into work, but she's really been punishing herself for 40 years. She hasn't been living her best life anyhow, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. Yeah, I think definitely with Jason, I mean, each time that comes up, that how much time he's taken over it, constantly shocks. So yeah, I can see what you're meaning there. Yeah, definitely.
In the final kind of chapters, when all of the showdown happens, I wrote a small scene as part of the larger chapter where Zach goes over to Jason and puts his hand on his shoulder, and he says, you can stop looking now. You found me. And I could cry now even saying it. I burst into tears as I wrote it, because the weight that had been on Jason for decades was finally being taken off him. And he was being released from this horrific jail that he has been in. But it's why he was never found guilty of doing anything to his stepson. He's been in prison for 40 years at the expense of his relationship with his daughter and his grandson, which obviously now can change. But that sentence for me is probably one of the most powerful of the whole book. And it really got me when I wrote it, because I wanted that for him. You know, you do want justice for Jason, right? You know, he kind of deserves it.
Probably a big relief for you writing that as well, considering the characters kind of in your head and everything. Yeah.
Yeah, they become real. It sounds crazy, but they do. The characters for me, I carry them for a full year. It takes me a full year to write a book. I'm literally dreaming about them at night, and they are in my every waking thought, and they become very real. And I really worry for them. I really do. And they're very important to me. I could see that final scene with Kimberley looking so elegant and so well dressed and so well spoken and so successful that she's done everything like she dreamed of. Because if you go back to the orphanage where Sally dreams of being working in a hair salon, but Elsie dreams of working in an office. Of course, she ends up cleaning offices. That's what she ends up doing because life is not that easy for a lot of people, for most of us. And I feel that Elsie went through so much. And then eventually Kimberley, she really finds out who she is. Like when she marries Jason and he's already got this successful business, but then she changes it. Like when she becomes involved, she has this really, really brilliant mind and she's able to bring that to the party and she throws herself into that. I had a very strong image of who she was and that she got the final scene. It had to be hers.
Was it difficult letting these characters go out of your head when you'd finished writing the book?
Yeah, such a good question. It was. You kind of almost mourn them because, as I said, they do become part of your extended family. And so then when you do say goodbye to them, it's difficult. But you have to, because what I do is I work according to my kids' school academic year.
Yeah.
I always start a new book on the 1st of September. So when they go back to school, that's when I crack open a new book. And so you have to let them go at that point. And I will have done all of the work at that point, and then I'll have to say, okay, you go back into them. What's been really interesting is because everything was finished last September. And then over the last couple of months, I'm back into their lives again because obviously the book is out and you're doing all of the marketing and publicity for it. So you have to kind of reacquaint yourself with them, and it's going to a little reunion with them all. But they're very important to me. You know, I worry about them. Elsie is who I worry about. I think when the door closes to her very, very elegant cream apartment that has been curated so meticulously with art and beautiful things, I think that's when it's quiet and it's silent and she's on her own. I worry about her. I think she's a victim of circumstance.
Absolutely, yeah. I feel very much for her as well, definitely. I've got a question that's possibly going to come out of left field. Kevin advises Lily to water her plants with pasta water. Is this a thing? Because I had never heard of it before.
I know, it's so funny, isn't it? Yeah, my dad told me that. My dad is a keen gardener. It doesn't matter what you give me, I'm going to make it die. I have not got green fingers. I really am so bad. And it's become a joke in our family because my dad has green fingers and lots of my siblings do too. My parents have the most beautiful gardens. Over decades, they have just got these gorgeous gardens. And the only trees in my garden, I have lots of trees in my garden, but I get my dad to plant them because I'm going to be in trouble. But yeah, he has said that to me. He said, pasta water is full of all these nutrients and it's got like lots of good stuff in it and which is good for plants. So yeah, it does work. So yeah, it is a true thing. Kevin, I did mold a little bit actually on my dad. A lot of the things that he says is stuff that my dad would say. You know what I mean? I kind of gave him a bit, which is why the pasta thing was there.
So then, the question that I think we've got to end on, what are you writing now?
My next book, which is called The Nowhere Girls. It starts in 1995 in Dublin, and two little girls are found on a train station in Dublin. They're 4 and 3, and they're waiting for their mother, who has told them not to move. And the station master finds them, and their mother never returns. And when he asks them their names, they only know their first name. They don't know their surname, nor do they know where they're from. They said that they live near the sea and near mountains, but they can't say what part of Ireland. They don't have names of any grandparents, aunts, uncles. They are literally a mystery. And they are dubbed in the press as they start looking for their family to come forward, and nobody does. And then in the present day, a journalist is writing a story about what happens to kids who are abandoned when they're adults, like how does it shape their life, where are they? And she becomes completely fixated on the Nowhere Girls, on finding them and on finding their mother and why did the mother disappear, where is she, and who these girls are, because they have since been adopted into new names, new families, whatever. It brings you to the 1970s, to kind of a post-Vietnam America where communes set up as a lot of disillusioned students decided to find a new way of living life to get away from the patriarchy and from the heavy hand of the government. So it's kind of interesting. And then it will come back to Ireland. So that's what I'm working on at the minute. So I'm kind of almost finished at first draft. And then I have to have all the fun of doing what I do, which is weaving the story. Like, as I explained to you already, I've written all the kind of elements in the 1960s and 70s. And I've got to kind of make it all make sense. So it's another thriller.
No, it sounds really good, and it sounds like it's got so much scope there as well.
Yeah. And again, I wanted to be the reader finds out at the same time as the journalist. The mother in particular, she's very much off the page. I did think about, would I do the story half in the point of view of the mother? And I've decided not to. I really want her to be this kind of mysterious figure. Kind of know how it's all going to end up, but I haven't quite got to the end of it yet, but nearly there.
I will keep up to date with whatever you put on Instagram. I'll follow that along and see.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Interesting. Carmel, this has been lovely having you today. Yeah, I have fully enjoyed your work. Thank you for being here today.
It was my pleasure. Like, it's been one of the most interesting interviews I've done. I've really enjoyed every second of it. So thank you for the great questions. Genuinely mean that.
I do hope you enjoyed this episode. Do join me next time. And if you have a moment to spare, please do leave a rating and/or review of this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Podcast Addict. Thank you. Authors Afterword episode 123 was recorded on the 17th of February and published on the 23rd of June 2025. Music and production by Charlie Place.